The criticism came from Capitol Records. Um, in a sense, it was the product manager said, "Hey, Brian, can't you give us some more stuff that sounds like California Girls?" And the answer was no. And so rather than criticize him when he said that, they sabotaged him.
You're watching the Nameless Visions video series brought to you by Dio and the Beach Boys subreddit. My name is Jenny Jamball, and I am here today with the man who I feel needs no introduction at all, David Leaf, the talented David Leaf. So before we get into our interview today, I just want to thank the team over at the Beach Boys subreddit. They are the ones who have made this conversation possible today. So a big thank you to them. And also noting that there will be an AMA with David coming up on Reddit soon. I don't know when, but watch this space. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask, just make a note of them, and that will be happening really soon. I'm sure David can't wait to answer all of your questions. So I'm sure you're all aware about David and his achievements, but if you aren't, let me just give you a very quick overview of some things that may be relevant to our conversation today. So first of all, he was part of the documentary Beautiful Dreamer, which was a beautiful insight into Brian's life during the time of Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So if you have not seen that, please, 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 please watch it. It is absolutely amazing. And the reason we are here today, his newest book, which we can see behind David there, thank you. We've got Smile, the Rise, the Fall, and the Resurrection of Brian Wilson. And I guess my first question would be in regard to the title, I suppose. The first time I heard about the title of the book, it really grabbed me, and I was like, I couldn't picture a better way to describe Smile from where it was and what it became. So I just wanted to hear some reflections on you about the thought process behind this title and what message you were trying to convey with that.
Uh, First, hi, Jenny. And second, it's the first time I've been asked that question.
Wonderful.
So well done right off the bat. Um, I actually wanted to call the book A Genius Revealed, the story of Brian Wilson and Smile. And the publisher said, no, we want the word smile in the title uh, for all the algorithms that exist on the internet. And so the subtitle, I wanted it to be something that would reflect on the journey that was Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So it seemed like the rise, fall, and resurrection of Brian Wilson fit that story well.
I really like that you brought up the word genius because that was something I noticed whilst reading the book, and I've been very fortunate to have early access to that. The language used throughout the book is so powerful, and just for some examples, just the words used are like things like captivating, terrifying, honest, unbelievable, vulnerable, and the main word that we see a lot is genius. And I did a little bit of search, and the word genius is used nearly 50 times throughout the book, which is that's 43 if we're going to be exact, which is such a testament to Brian and his work. That also leads me to think, what is the weight of that word on Brian? I know for me, I would find that so intimidating.
Well, now you're two for two, Jenny, with questions that no one's asked. So this is going to be a great conversation. There was an interview in the mid '60s with Brian where he said, "I'm not a genius, I'm ingenious." You'll note that the book begins with a quote from Albert Einstein, who was indisputably a genius. And when Van Dyke Parks was a young boy and was living in Princeton going to school, he actually had the opportunity to be in Einstein's presence. So Van Dyke said, I've been in the presence of genius. I know what that is. So he would not use that word for Brian. He would talk about brilliant and incredible, and wonderful, and all those other adjectives. But genius is it's credited to Derek Taylor in terms of the public eye as to when that word began to describe Brian. But if you listen to the most horrible tape in Beach Boys history, the Help Me Murray tape,
Hmm.
you hear his father say, I'm a genius too. So clearly, a year before Derek Taylor and the British press was calling Brian a genius, the word was floating around. I think it's been a terrible burden
I agree.
on Brian. He did not want to be seen as a genius. He really sees himself as a regular person. Everybody who knows him and all his friends through the years know that he just loves to hang out and have fun and make people laugh and have something to eat. And being a genius is not part of that. He just wants to be, as Jeffrey Foskett says in the book, Brian Douglas Wilson. But that was not his fate. His fate was to create music that was so out of the ordinary for what popular music was in 66 in particular, that the only word that fit was genius. Now, when the late Sir George Martin says, if I have to select one living genius, it would be Brian Wilson. And when Elton John said, Sir Elton John says that Brian Wilson is, the only genius in popular music, uh, who are we to argue? In that same era, we stood over the table once with a bunch of index cards on which I had written the titles of every Smile fragment, and we tried to sequence it. We failed. Another time I'd said to him, I said, Brian, I really would like to get a symphony orchestra to perform this music with a choir because it's just too beautiful to not be heard. And he said, good, I deserve that.
Their screen name is Round Rectangles, and they want to know about the rite of passage of Beach Boys fans to come up with their own renditions of Smile, their own playlists or remix or tracking of the songs. So, how do you view this aspect of Smile and its impact on the album's legacy and potentially a bigger question, the music industry as a whole?
Well, there's a section in the book that talks about the DIY nature of Smile,
Yeah.
because for years there was no disc called Smile that you could put on a turntable. There was no cassette. There was no way to play Smile. So fans took it into their own hands. Interestingly enough, the man who runs president of None Such Records that released Brian Wilson Presents Smile, he was one of those fans too. And I don't think one can overestimate how important it was that fans were doing that and can still do that now with the Beach Boys Smile sessions. I don't think I think it's wonderful, no pun intended. The music, as David Anderley tells the story, that Brian would come home from the studio with acetates and say, this is going to be part of Cabin Essence. And they would go, no, Brian, that was great when it was part of Wonderful. And then they would listen to it and they'd go, oh, you're right. It's, oh my God, it's better. So if Brian was doing that,
Mm.
it makes sense that now that the pieces are out in the world, that the fans can do it. Now, long before the pieces were out in the world, when there was just a handful of actual official releases and a whole bunch of stuff on bootleg, I think that's what kept, in a sense, a Brian Wilson community together. And I think the combination of the do-it-yourself tapes and Dominic Priore's uh, classic book, Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, where so one could read about the contemporaneous articles from back in the day about Smile. So one could get a sense, oh, this is what people were expecting. And then you could, with a couple of cassette decks or however you did it, make your own version of Smile. I think that was great. It wasn't anything I ever did because I just would listen to the music. I wasn't trying to figure out a sequence. That never mattered to me which song I heard first. I think like a lot of people, I felt like Surf's Up had to be last. As David Anderley says in the book, he never thought Good Vibrations was part of Smile at all. He just thought it was the step from Pet Sounds to Smile. So as record companies do, they insist on including your big hit record on your next album. Brian and I met with Capitol Records in 1995 after the success of the Good Vibrations box set with a 5-year plan to reissue 30th anniversary packages of Beach Boys music. If the fan community isn't doing the DIY, if the bootlegs aren't being made, if the Good Vibrations box set doesn't happen and get such a strong reaction, if Brian doesn't start touring again, if he doesn't do full albums like Pet Sounds, nothing can happen like Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So there's just so many steps along the way, so many dominoes that were not ruined, that came into existence because of the passion of everybody involved. So this was a subject not so much that critics were criticizing in advance of Brian Wilson Presents Smile, so much as it was the critic in his brain, based on what he had heard in late 66 and into 67. Brian, this music isn't right for the Beach Boys. Brian, this music is too advanced for our audience. Brian, what are you doing? This isn't Beach Boys music. And that had become what he believed. And the moment he performed it at Royal Festival Hall, that all evaporated.
That also leads me to think about criticism as well. And how important do you think criticism was for Brian on this project, and whether that hindered its success, contributed to its success, or just didn't really make a difference? I'm of the mind that criticism does play a part, and sometimes we can't really reach the places we need to reach without that because it's kind of a push. But knowing how, fragile Brian can be at times, and we all are as humans, how that impacted him and his work, especially picking up something so many years later.
This was not somebody who shrunk from a challenge. He was well aware of what he was saying, and he was saying it with complete confidence. Now, talk about setting the bar high. Whether you called him a genius or ingenious, he knew he was making incredible music, and he knew there was incredible music ahead of him when he said that. Now, in terms of criticism, are we talking about in 66, 67, or are we talking about it in 2003, 2004?
Say you could reflect on both, because you needed the stuff in 66 and 67 to happen to get to where he was in 2003. But I guess to really focus on the current, I don't know if many people were really being critical at that time, because Smile had been built up to be such an enigma that everyone was just more excited than critical. But I'm just really conscious of how critics do play a part, and not everyone's going to be excited about these types of projects.
Criticism comes from different places. And in Brian's world, in 66, the record company was critical of the direction he was taking the Beach Boys in. His father was critical of the direction he was taking the Beach Boys in. And from everything we've heard, it seems that the Beach Boys weren't exactly enthralled with the direction he was taking the group in. So with Pet Sounds, he was able to shrug it off, except when it didn't sell as well as he anticipated. There weren't that many critics in America in 66, and it got, I think Richard Goldstein in New York gave it a rave review. There weren't that many places to really write significant, substantial reviews. The criticism came from Capitol Records. In a sense, it was the product manager said, "Hey, Brian, can't you give us some more stuff that sounds like California Girls?" And the answer was no. And so rather than criticize him when he said that, they sabotaged him. So they shipped Best of the Beach Boys when record stores were reordering Pet Sounds, making it impossible for Pet Sounds to sell, millions of copies. In England, that didn't happen. He got rave reviews for Pet Sounds in England. And that began to create the legend of what he was working on next. First Good Vibrations and then Smile. Um, Again, the record company is a very funny quote from Brian. Where he says the record company came to me and says, "We'd like some more commercial records," and he was like, "See you later." You know, that's not what I'm doing. And the critics in his world were silenced with Good Vibrations because it was a million selling #1 single. The Smile music in his inner circle, not including the Beach Boys, because the Beach Boys were touring, but his inner circle was raving about this music, raving in a good way. And so there wasn't criticism. What there was when the Beach Boys returned was a lack of complete support. That Brian, we think this is the most brilliant thing we've ever heard. We can't wait to get into the studio and do the vocals. Now, that said, when they recorded their vocals, their singing is magnificent. There's nobody, including Brian's band, who is going to tell you that the Beach Boys vocals are anything but the best in the world. That their blend is spectacular. It's unique. Now that's the musical instrument he created. Now there was some resentment at being treated as just a musical instrument. Now, whether you call that criticism or just turmoil, it created some of the problems that led to him shelving Smile. There were issues with the Beach Boys. There were issues with drugs. There were issues with the record company. There were issues with how long it would take him to finish the record. In Beautiful Dreamer, which you kindly referred to, he said, I figured I needed a year and nobody would give me a year.
You have you have a lot of material, rejected material or material that is sort of shelved going, since we sort of went into music here, that you haven't released.
We've poked, we've touched upon quite a few different bags, and with us, it's just been a real experience, just bouncing around all the bags,
Right.
Now, my guess is that from the time he shelved it until the time he presented it to the world on February 20th, 2004, he never did an interview in which he wasn't asked about Smile. Imagine, if you would, if you had a child who died in childbirth, and every time your friends talked to you for the next 36 years, they said, "Oh, hey, have you gotten over that?" When Vince Gill, David Crosby, and Jimmy Webb played Surf's Up, when the boys' choir sang Our Prayer, he saw how much the audience loved this music, and that kind of broke the ice. And he started adding songs from Smile to his set, and eventually got to Royal Festival Hall. Now, through all that period, all that time when he's reemerging, starting with his first solo album in '88, then in 1995 when he's done the album Orange Crate Art with Van Dyke Parks, which of course brings up questions of Smile every time he does an album to promote that album. He said, "Believe it or not, David, for the first time in my career, I can't wait to go back out on tour again." He wanted to play Smile for the world, and he did.
From the very beginning, Smile was filled with emotion. Even the title itself, Brian is saying that, the healing power of laughter. That's why it's called Smile. But it's kind of ironic that it didn't really have a lot of laughter at some points. It was quite harrowing. My question from this is, do you think Brian needed this?
We wanted it for him. And we never thought it was going to happen in a live situation. So that was the kind of one of the biggest surprises. It made it possible, as Darian Sahanaja says, for him to approach the music not as finishing an album, figuring out how to perform the music live and what sequence that would make sense, which was a kind of a sneaky way of finishing the album. But he definitely needed this. This would be, this was from the point of view of fanatics like me and Ray Lawler and Debbie and Eva, who had lived with this in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, always hoping, believing, and dreaming that if he ever finished Smile, it would free him to create new great music.
It's so wonderful that he had that experience and that so many people played a part in bringing it to fruition, because he clearly needed it. And that's what I feel. It was like a creative spark, and emotionally was so important to his journey moving forward. So I'm just so thankful that it happened. And just thinking about how,
He was terrified.
oh, I
He was
completely
terrified.
can't.
And
Yeah.
and there were a number of times prior to going to London where he was asked, we can cancel this. Let's stop right now. And he said, no, I have to do it. Have to do it.
I can respect that so much, because I think many of us, being human faced with big challenges like that, it's very easy to just say, you know what, too much. I'm going to put that in the too hard basket and I'm never looking at that again. But I think really thinking about Brian and how brave he truly was to conquer his fear and to go out and to give something to us, because how you mentioned the inclusive nature of the album, he recognizes that it is a part of so many people. So I think really sitting with the acknowledgement of the bravery that Brian took to take that step to be out there. And I guess, what was that like for you, being a part of something so emotionally charged? Because you would have seen so many different sides of Brian during this time. What was that like for you, seeing that and helping him through that? Because he definitely sees you as an emotional support. So what was that like for you?
As a friend, your job, as if you're a real friend, is to support your friend.
Mm.
And so I was supporting my friend as he was trying to do something that we knew how difficult it was. I mean, after all, on the second day of vocal rehearsals, he drives himself to the emergency room. He's so fearful of what's going on. But he got over that. He got over the hump. And so there was always a new fear until London. And the first night in London was as triumphant and as wonderful a moment as I think I'll ever experience in my life.
I can't even imagine. I would have loved to have been there and to experience that, you
Well,
know.
it's one of the reasons, in designing the book the way
Mm.
I did, there's an entire chapter of fan reminiscences of how they felt looking back 20 years later. What did being there that night mean to you? And I think it's one of the most powerful parts of the book, because we're all fans. Uh, I've just taken it to the excessive extreme of moving to California and writing books and making films and all of that. Um, it's these were life-changing moments for a lot of people. These were, I mean, I think I said this once before. You would have wanted to have the Kleenex concession at the Royal Festival Hall that night. Everybody was in tears.
It's remarkable that a piece of work like that can hold so much. And I think my biggest takeaway from this book, apart from having this story out there in print, is just recognizing that you've given a voice to so many people who may have felt like they didn't have a platform to share how they really feel about something that's been so impactful on their lives. And just the cultural impact is wonderful to think about, how many people this has touched.
It has touched a lot of people. The album itself sold 800,000 copies. The biggest selling Brian or Beach Boys album um, since Beach Boys Party, I think.
Yeah.
So it was, 40 years later, I mean, that was remarkable just on a business point of view. So it got to a lot of people. The thing that I've come to understand about all of this is that it really, more than anything, it was the triumph of the human spirit that that Brian couldn't have done it on his own. He needed to be surrounded with this velvet glove of these devoted musicians. He needed an audience filled with people who loved him unconditionally, and friends surrounding him who loved him unconditionally. It was all of that. So it was about humanity as much as it was about music.
Think this answers the question perfectly and moves on quite nicely to the next question that we have from another user, which kind of tacks on to what you've just said. So this user, their name is Vim Vinyl, and they're from not the Beach Boys Reddit, but the Lemon Twigs Reddit, which they kind of intertwine, Beach Boys, Lemon Twigs,
They
you know.
sure do.
But their question is also reflecting on how Smile is such an album that's just been mixed and evolved, and it's just a legendary album. So they want to know, do you think that the original Smile, if it had been released, would have had such a unique place in rock history, and were the fans ready for it?
Let's take these in pieces. First of
Yes.
all, Vim, I went to see the Lemon Twigs in December here in Los Angeles with Darian Sahanajan, Robin Gregory, and they're incredible, as you already know because you're on the Lemon Twigs Reddit. It's not an accident that the older brother, Brian Paul, is named after Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney. It's not an accident. I mean, I was stunned when he told me he had read The Beach Boys and the California Myth when he was like 9 years old.
Wow.
They are so melodic. They have so many hooks in their songs. They sing so beautifully that it's stunning how great they are, which is why they get a mention in the epilogue, because they are clearly carrying forth this legacy of popular music that is melodic and filled with harmony. So God bless them. And Brian's got a new solo album out, which you can hear, and I'm looking forward to the next Lemon Twigs album and hope to see them again. It was the first concert I'd been to since the outbreak of COVID.
Wow, a good first concert to get back into it.
Absolutely.
So the question was, if the original Smile,
if Smile had come
yeah.
out, so we have to take it in two different sections. In England, they were desperately waiting for Smile because of the publicity that Derek Taylor had generated. As he called Heroes and Villains the most famous unreleased single, or the most famous single no one's yet to hear.
Yeah.
So England had embraced Pet Sounds. They were embracing all sorts of new music like the Pink Floyd, and I mean, you name it. England would have embraced Smile, whether it came before or after Sgt. Pepper. They would have embraced it. The question might be, if it had come out before Sgt. Pepper, what would the Beatles have done? Would they have said, maybe we need to do something different with a couple of the tracks on Sgt. Pepper? I mean, who knows? Would they have taken it back? In America, the question is, how would the audience have embraced it here? So there was finally in America in 1967, there was a growing rock press like Crawdaddy. And Paul Williams, may he rest in peace, was in love with Smile. I mean, he and David Anderle have a whole book filled with their conversations about Smile, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to hear about it and theorize about it in the, again, contemporaneous, because things changed so much over the years as to what people had to say. So what would the American public have done in 67 with Smile? Well, I would guess that the same people who bought Pet Sounds would have bought Smile. That a lot of the people who bought Good Vibrations would have said, an entire album filled with music created in the same modular style that Good Vibrations was. I've got to check that out. The the question that I think was raised at the time was A, Capitol Records, and B, the Beach Boys touring group. What are we going to do with this music? Well, the Beach Boys touring group, all they had to do was add Heroes and Villains to the lineup as the latest single. So the latest single that we heard, the Heroes and Villains single, was not Brian's original conception of Heroes and Villains. So if the original Heroes and Villains had been done, then it might have been a different story. It may have never gotten on AM radio as a 1 and 2 parts piece that was 7 minutes long. It may have only been played on FM as like, this is really cool. There's just no answers to it. But what we can say is that by not finishing Smile, by shelving it, that it almost overnight made the Beach Boys irrelevant.
We had about 6 months before that we were doing different things, but we jumped.
The last question I have is probably a bit of a loaded question, so I'll leave it with you on how you want to answer this. But this
Okay.
question is from The Laughing Gravy, and without giving too much away, what information is included in the book that hasn't been known or released before? Now, you can't give us too much because obviously we want people to buy the book, but maybe just a little taste to get us all excited.
Well, I think, Mr. Gravy, I don't know that it's details. I shouldn't say I don't know that it's information so much as it's a giant canvas of details that are painted in 2003, 2004 by Brian's band as they're experiencing it being put back together, as they're reconstructing it. The depth of the quotes, because remember, when you make a documentary, people get to talk for a sentence or two. So Van Dyke Parks in this book gets to talk, when he talks, it's for a paragraph or two or three. And you get a sense of how smart he is, how the wordplay that's always at work, not just when he's writing lyrics, but just as he speaks about things. When he talks about just the experience of the first time he goes to Brian's house and hears the work in progress of Sloop John B, and he's there for an hour and a half. When he describes how he felt when he left that night, it's not, oh boy, that was an incredible night. It's just, you got to get, as I say, you have to have, a dictionary handy when he's talking, because he's just so full of information you want to understand completely. And I really believe, you can't get all of this in me giving you a couple of details. What details are there that are in this book? Well, here's Tom Nolan in the anthology, and I think a lot of the anthology essays are full of things we wouldn't otherwise know. But here's one, Mr. Gravy. And I don't think this story has been told anywhere, but Tom tells a story about Brian putting a loudspeaker on the hood of his car, and this is near the Hawthorne house. And when he thought his parents were in the bedroom being intimate, he gets on the loudspeaker as if he's the police, and it's like, "Okay, we know what you're doing in there. Come on out." Those kinds of, there's so many stories about Brian that you'll hear in this book that you haven't heard. I don't think it's I don't think it's facts. I think it's an understanding of how things happened. Facts, go to 10452 Bellagio. That website has all the facts in the world, all the known facts that there are. And Andrew Doe was very helpful with the research on this book. But I think it's just the depth of the storytelling and Nelson Bragg said this. I don't know if you have this in Australia, Jenny, but here in the States, when we used to get assigned books in school and
Mm.
you didn't want to read them, there were these things called Cliff Notes
Mm.
that you could buy maybe for a quarter, and it would have all of the key bits of information you needed to know to write the essay the teacher was going to sign. So instead of
Amazing.
reading the book, you would read the Cliff Notes.
Yeah.
And Nelson Bragg said after reading the book, he said, "Beautiful Dreamer was like reading the Cliff Notes version of this book." And he then said, it answers all the questions you had about Smile and questions you didn't even know to ask, which is a wonderful thing for him to say. But it's kind of not true. There are people who have questions that are unanswerable. You can ask them, but Van Dyke's not going to tell you the answer to some of those questions because A, he doesn't want to talk about it, and B, he probably doesn't remember. And so a lot of this is going to remain a mystery.
I started to feel really conscious of the power of love, you know? And so many things started happening at one time. I blew my mind,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Completely blew it. And ever since I blew my mind, everything has just been so groovy,
Right.
you know? That's what happened to me.
This book is about feels at every step of the process, of every step of the story. It's how the people who were there felt about what was going on. And I think that's the best way I can uh, describe it.
I feel like Brian really makes himself very vulnerable, which was reflected upon quite a lot in the book. A lot of people are referencing that, the vulnerability that is there throughout, Brian Wilson Presents Smile, as well as the early stages of it in 66 and 67.
Well, it's
Um,
it's it's there from the very beginning, the lonely
Absolutely.
sea. I mean, this guy is there's a melancholy um, in his voice, in his heart, in his soul, in his songs that can only come from growing up in a household filled with, you know, we don't know how bad it was, but
Mm.
we know what a sensitive soul he is. So even if it's not as bad as has been described, it affected him dramatically and changed his abilities in life, not his ability to make music, but his ability to stand up for himself.
So thankful for all the people that were a part of this journey and were surrounding him with that support and that love and that encouragement that he needed. Because, as you've referenced, so much of that was kind of stripped away very early on in his creative career. So I think just kind of talking about you a little bit, David. I think there was a couple of times in the book where whether it was yourself or other people kind of acknowledging you and your contribution towards all of this, and just taking a second to highlight that and celebrate that and acknowledge the part that you played in all of this. How does it feel to know that you have played such a huge part in this journey of Brian Wilson Presents Smile?
Oh, now you're going to make me cry. Um, it's unbelievable.
Mm.
Um, this book, the last book from 2022, God Only Knows, which was a massive update, kind of like if you were reading my diary from the years since the Beach Boys and the California Myth. And this book and who knows more books to come. I feel an obligation because of the place I've had and what I've seen and experienced to share as much as possible, not just with today's fans, but for Brian's legacy, so that when researchers are studying him 50, 100, 200 years from now, it's as much as possible is there. As to my role, um, it's unbelievable, honestly.
Mm.
I teach a number of courses at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, and in my documentary class, I end the quarter by showing Beautiful Dreamer to the students. And I say to them, you know, we've watched a lot of documentaries this quarter, and we've always talked about them beforehand and analyzed them in one way or another. This time we're going to watch a film, and then I'm going to tell you a story afterwards. So after they've watched Beautiful Dreamer, I then tell them a story. And I say to them, when I was sitting where you are, when I was 19, I became obsessed with Brian Wilson and Smile. And my roommate and I, we went down this rabbit hole. And one day my roommate said, well, if you're so upset about it, why don't you do something about it? And that's when I came up with this crazy notion. I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile. It's clear to me that this was some sort of calling, some sort of mission that I was on from the moment I read Tom Nolan's article in Rolling Stone and heard the song Surf's Up Until I Die on the Surf's Up album. It was something doesn't make sense here. And I had started college as a journalism major, but the instinct was still in me to be outraged at whatever was wrong. And so it was like an investigative journey. And, you know, if we talk about Brian's life as a jigsaw puzzle with 10 million pieces and Smile as a jigsaw puzzle with 1 million pieces, in this book, you know, I've got a couple 100,000 pieces told by the people who lived it and experienced it in one way or another. As an oral history, the book is designed not for me to tell you what to think about Smile, but for all these other people to tell the story. And my conclusions haven't really changed since I wrote The Beach Boys and the California Myth back in 1978. My adult understanding has. So I was a kid when I wrote the book. I was 25. So now I'm, you know, an elder statesman. I'm in my 70s. And so when I look back, I can understand why they were scared. They all had homes and wives and families. And what is this going to do to the Beach Boys as a business? What is this going to do to our careers? So I can understand that now in a way that I couldn't have, you know, nearly a half century ago. And so hopefully this book has more kindness to it. There's no one to blame. There's just life.
Eventually, we're headed for heaven. I think so.
Are you headed for heaven?
Yeah.
All of us have a chance.
Yes.
feature
I think
movie.
it's going to get people off.
It's a feature movie for sure.
I think it's an animated movie.
It could.
I do. I think it's an animated feature movie.